Welcome to Five Questions, and today we have Ben Williams with us, and he's actually a returning guest. And Ben was the first video that I did, and so he's already introduced himself. He works for the Glenpool Church of Christ, but also has edited a book, Why We Stayed. And maybe tell us a little bit about that to start off with.
Yeah, it was a compilation book with lots of different editors and contributors, lots of different authors and contributors, including yourself, who wrote on different topics and elements of Church of Christ and our heritage. We all usually nodded in some direction to say, here's something we're frustrated by, but on the whole, this is something good about us, and there's a reason to stick around and work within our movement in our churches. And I hope it provides some optimism for ministers who might be struggling with the sausage making part of preaching life. That's what the book was for.
Yeah, and people might want to check that out. It's a great book. Really good chapter on the Lord's Supper. I just can't.
So I hear.
Yeah.
No bias whatsoever.
Yeah, really. But Ben's with us today to talk about something that I've been fascinated by for a while now, and that's the concept of time, and specifically time within Scripture. And one of the reasons why I asked Ben to be with us is because he does a podcast entitled Low Church Lectionarians, and that you kind of work yourself through the church calendar. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
And so you've got an episode every single week, where you're digging into
when I'm not in Kansas City like this week, I would have an episode every single week.
Yes. I realize doing this myself that sometimes things come up, and so you have to skip a week or so. But you and Grant Sullivan do an outstanding job of looking at the text, and it's something for everyone, I think, to listen to, regardless if you're a preacher or not. If you're just a person in the pew, it's a wonderful thing to listen to in your car or while you're working out. And you can just get a Bible study that's 20, 30 minutes long.
Yeah, that's the goal for sure.
And so let's begin with time, and let's just kind of start with a generic question. How does time shape us? So not necessarily maybe spiritual time, but just time in general, even secular time.
Well, the way we think of time definitely is a reflection of our values and what we think is important. So I notice you have that awful Red Sox hat on today. If you're a big baseball fan, then you think of the year as starting and beginning in baseball season. If you're an NBA fan, your year is about to come to an end with the finals. If you're a teacher, maybe the calendar starts in January, but your year starts and ends with August and May with the school year. And then nationally, we have a calendar that exists to kind of put a story in our mind. On our calendar, we have fixed dates, and what are they? We've got Memorial Day and Veterans Day and 4th of July. These are events on the calendar that shape the year around a national story that says these are things you should remember. And they're kind of spread out like that, and we close everything down. So the way we shape our time definitely reflects our values. It doesn't just reflect our values, it also creates our values. If you live with a certain calendar long enough, you're going to think along the lines of that calendar.
Mm-hmm. And that applies to many different situations. Those of us with small kids, or even older kids, think in terms of the school calendar.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so now jumping to Scripture, what role does time play in Scripture?
So in Scripture, it does exactly that function. It's a means, or at least the way we think of time and the way it's portrayed, is a means of conveying the message and values of God's story. So, for example, the earliest units of time have to do with the creation account. It's laid out in terms of time. So you are supposed to think, every week as this is a little microcosm and reenactment of creation. And you'd roll around eventually to Sabbath, which was a day when you remembered this is God making the week. It's worth noting, it's a fascinating feature of human culture that the 7-day week is kind of pervasive. It's the way everybody thinks of time. That one, of all things, has stuck around, and that's good. But also Jewish festivals and so forth work the same way. The Passover was a way of, on a yearly basis, reminding yourself and being reminded of reenacting even the story of the Passover, which was the founding story of Judaism. So time throughout Scripture, the feasts and festivals, the weekly routines, was a way of every time that rolled around, you're reenacting that story and bringing it to the forefront.
And so, just as you're going through the year, you're constantly reminded of the stories of
Exactly.
God, and you're
Yeah,
living.
that's what you're living out.
Yeah, yeah. You know, you mentioned creation, you mentioned Sabbath, and so the first time that time comes up, it's right there at the very beginning. So you have the seven
Yeah.
days, which, interestingly, I don't know if we want to talk about this so much, but that number seven is very prominent in Revelation as well.
Yeah.
You know, and so you have those kind of bookends there. But then you have the Sabbath day, which is the first thing in Scripture that is declared holy. And so, what's the significance of that?
That's a good question, and a lot of debate comes out of that. The significance of Sabbath seems to first be rooted in the creation story, and that it definitely was a way to reenact that, but also of one of the founding claims of the creation story, and that is in the ancient world, people thought of creation as kind of this thing the gods were involved in, but kind of in a weird way. Um, Humanity might be a weird byproduct of gods fighting in heaven or something like that, and it might be an ongoing story. Who knows? And the notion of Hebrew thought, but so important to us, that creation is a story that it comes to a conclusion in a sense. That's not saying that God never made anything again, but the story of God making things had a purpose, had a function, and at the end of it, God could say, "And this was good." And so Sabbath was a way of saying there is a way the world is supposed to be. That's the way God made it. And so Sabbath was a time of rest and reflection on the world as it was supposed to be. Um, on Sabbath day, it didn't really matter if you were a slave or a free man, or if you were rich or poor. Like, everybody's Sabbath was the same Sabbath. It was a way of saying there is a way things are supposed to be, and every week we will remember that, and that God is at peace and wants us to be in that peace.
Okay. Well, you've already referenced how there's this Jewish calendar, and it's prominent in
Yeah.
the lives of the Jewish people. Pretty early on, we get a Christian calendar. You know,
Yep.
sometimes called a lectionary, but maybe better described as an ancient Christian calendar.
Yep.
What was the purpose in creating something like that?
Exactly what we're talking about. If you're going to have time and think about time in some kind of terms, and you have to, whose time ought it to be? Whose story ought to be on display? Everybody's got one. So even to this day, kind of unconsciously unaware, we have very pagan ideas in our calendar of Thor's Day and whatnot. I mean, everything is built around some kind of religious concept. And I'm not saying we should stop calling it Thursday because we're not Vikings, but I'm saying, that was how time was measured and told, was in narrative. And so Christians said, we need to be telling the year through the lens of the story of Christ. And we need to relive that and keep that in front of us in the same way Jewish people did, and in the way all ancient peoples did. The year belongs to the Lord and his story. So they crafted a calendar as a way of just telling that story in its basic form, that you couldn't go one full revolution around the sun without encountering the basic principles of God's story. So you'd have the season that they called Advent, which was kind of parallel to the times of the Old Testament. There was a waiting and a patience for the coming of God. And then they would have Christmas, which was the idea of, we're going to recognize Christ, in fact, was born. He was. It matters. And we'll recognize that. And then we would have events that kind of celebrate the life of Christ. Lent had to do with the temptations of Christ. And then we would talk about the Holy Week, the week where Christ suffers and dies. And then Easter, which would be a time of his resurrection. They would talk about the significance of the resurrection all the way out till Pentecost, which in Acts chapter 2 is significant, where you would start for the rest of the year talking about, okay, how does the church live out that story? And then you come back around to Advent and do it all the way over again. So every year, through a selection of its text from the Bible, it's all very, the calendar is biblical in the sense that you don't get a calendar in the book of Romans, but all the concepts are just taking the Bible and saying, how do we want to talk about that over 365 days? And they just laid it out. And every year the church relived the story of Jesus through those events. How is that not better than any other way we'd want to arrange our calendar? Why would we want anything else but Jesus as the story we live out every year? You could ask yourself, instead of what month is it, at what point in the story of Jesus am I right now?
Yeah, I think a false assumption that I made for a long time is that just time is neutral and it doesn't have an effect on me. But in reality, it does, and I'm either going to choose a secular calendar or a Christian calendar, and that's going to have an impact on me. And so, what do I want to choose?
And that hit me in the academic world when there's kind of this pressure to stop using AD for years and to use kind of Common Era, CE. And I thought, why would anyone care whether you called it AD or CE? Why would a person be offended if I said AD? And why am I kind of bothered by not calling it AD? Because AD has something to do with Jesus. And I'm kind of nodding both parties there. The person who likes it and the person who doesn't is saying it kind of matters how you divide up time and history. And that's just one example of that.
Yeah. Well, so how can following the ancient Christian calendar be helpful to people today?
In all the ways that we said, it's a way of saying my life is not my own. This is not my story playing out in a secular world where somewhere in the distant past there might have been a God and a Jesus and a gospel. You're saying the most important thing that has ever happened is replaying itself in my life every year. And I'm going to map my life into that. I'm going to make sure that life, that story, is fundamental to the way I view every day, every week, every year of my life. And I don't know how it could get more essential than that to the way we view our lives.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot for joining us. And, if people want to start living into this and kind of get an idea, a very easy way to do that is to subscribe to the podcast, And so we'll put a link to that in the comments. And I think that is a great introduction, because it's not overwhelming. Again, it's usually, I think, around between 20 and 30 minutes every week. And, you and Grant do a great job. And so we'll put a link to that. And there's some other probably helpful tools out there as well.
A great little book is by Weber, Ancient Future Time. Is the name of it, and he has a whole series of ancient future faith, ancient future evangelism, but he does time, and he just explains how did Christians think of time in the early years, and how could we start thinking that way again. It's a good introduction to the concept. I recommend it.
Okay.
And it's short.
Yeah, well, that's good. All right, Ben. Well, thanks a lot for joining us, and look for another video next week.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott.